Hey kids, how you doing? Interesting article that we've got going on this particular subject here. Now we've watched a whole bunch of movies in class either before this as well as during the World War II unit, and this is one of the only ones that we talk about where it's talking specifically about movies, making movies, that sort of thing. Because what we're going to be getting into here is a movie about World War II that was made during World War II, while the fighting was actually going on, before they knew who was going to win. And that makes it a little bit different than other things that we've watched, such as Band of Brothers or that part of Enemy at the Gates or uh, Dunkirk. Take your pick of any of the movies that we watched that are all much more modern versions of that. The people who made those movies knew how the war was going to come out. This not so much. And these movies, not only were they made to entertain, but they were made also to get very specific support for the Allied side. And the Allies weren't the only ones who made movies during the war. There are German World War II movies that are out there. There are Japanese ones that are out there. So they put their movie industry to work trying to get support for their side in the war. And that's what we're gonna be reading about. So let's take a look at it here. Okay, Hollywood goes to war. The studio system. As the United States entered World War II, the Hollywood studio system was at its peak. When sound was added to movies in the late 1920s, Hollywood became extraordinarily popular and film stars became household names. This increased in the Great Depression as many Americans looked to movies to provide entertainment and help them escape from economic difficulties at home. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, American society shifted into high gear for the war effort. This included Hollywood. President Roosevelt declared the movies a vital wartime industry, putting film on par with steel, shipbuilding, and textiles as things that Americans had to have in order to win the war. Roosevelt met with the heads of American studios and instructed them to make movies that would gain support of the American people for the war effort. With a huge stable of Hollywood stars available that were fully supportive of the war effort, their job was easy. In World War II, the Hollywood studios made hundreds of movies designed to gain support for the United States and the Allies. Some movies were great and are still revered today. Some were quickly forgotten, and many were somewhere in the middle. Then, just as now, the more talent and money that were lavished on the project often determined how successful the movie was. Many Hollywood actors joined the military and were assigned to what was called the Special Services. This meant their main job was to work in Hollywood and make movies for the war effort. Many, though, actually volunteered for combat duty. It's a Wonderful Life star Jimmy Stewart was decorated for bravery in his service as a bomber pilot and commander in Europe. And there's a picture of Jimmy Stewart, certainly an old time Hollywood star. But if you see It's a Wonderful Life around Christmas time, he was the main character in that movie. So that's one chance you might have to see it. The Enemy. The most obvious feature of Hollywood war movies that were made during the war was their treatment of the Germans and the Japanese. In war movies of that period, there was no attempt to humanize the enemy. In fact, the opposite was true. The Axis powers are almost always characterized as mean, cruel, sadistic animals that would stoop to any level to attain victory. Playing on Americans' feelings after the sneak attack at Pearl Harbor, they were portrayed as fanatical and deceitful on all levels and never to be trusted. Americans and their allies, on the other hand, were always portrayed as honorable, brave, and really just desirous of doing their job, getting the war over so they could go back to doing what they loved. When an American died in a war movie, it was usually a sad scene where he had a chance to say goodbye to his friends, who now, of course, had a personal reason to hate the enemy. When someone German or Japanese died in a Hollywood war movie, which happened more often, it was typically screaming, bloody, and fiery. Of course, the truth was never that simple. In fact, many of the actors portraying those evil Germans were themselves refugees from Europe. They came to America because their political views made them enemies to the Nazis or the fascists that were in power in their home countries in the 1930s. Actors such as Conrad Veidt and Peter Lorre left hugely successful careers in Germany because of their opposition to the Nazis. Ironically, for most of the war, since they had German accents, they ended up playing the very same Nazis in the movies that they hated so much in real life. In their minds, playing evil Nazis was the one way they could help to convince people in their adopted home country of the USA of the danger of the Nazi threat. If it helped win the war for the Allies and bring down Adolf Hitler, then German actors such as Veidt, Laurie, and Helmut Dantine were happy to be as evil as possible on screen. Sadly, the actors who portrayed the Japanese in World War II were usually either Chinese or Korean. There were virtually no Japanese American actors working in Hollywood, California in the war years because the Japanese American population on the West Coast was interred for much of the war. Ultimately, Hollywood provided the United States and the Allied countries with some of its most effective propaganda, swinging public opinion to the Allied cause. Some movies, such as Casablanca and Mrs. Miniver, succeeded doubly. First, as Allied propaganda, and second, as Academy Award winning films that are still loved today. So, much like with anything, you get, some of these movies are great and people can still watch them now, and then there are others, that weren't so great and they don't get watched anymore, but they all kind of had these things in common. You see there in that picture, that's a picture of Conrad Veidt there on the left and Peter Lorre on the right. Conrad Veidt had a Jewish wife and he hated the Nazis, so he knew he needed to get out of Germany because he was on their list. And Peter Lorre himself was Jewish, so he definitely had to get out of Germany. But they came to Hollywood and they played mostly the enemy, even though they couldn't stand the Nazis. But they played Nazis and during the war years. They probably wished they could do some other stuff, but to them, that was their way of contributing to the war effort. So. We see that, and we're going to see that in these movies. You'll see examples of people being exceptionally good or exceptionally evil, almost like a caricature of that sort of thing. So that's kind of where we're going here. Okay, we'll see you soon.